Aisha sat motionless in the courtroom, her fingers gripping the edge of the bench as the judge delivered the verdict. Not guilty. The words echoed through the silent hall like a death sentence. Only this time, the victim was justice itself. Her brother's killer, a man with undeniable evidence stacked against him, smirked as he walked free. The system had failed her. Tears burned in Aisha's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, a cold resolve settled within her. If the law couldn't punish the guilty, she would. That evening, as the courthouse emptied and the judge stepped outside, Aisha was waiting. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but her grip on the gun was steady. The man who had let a murderer walk free barely had time to react before she pulled the trigger. A single shot. The judge collapsed, his blood staining the steps of the very institution meant to uphold justice. Chaos erupted instantly. Gasps, screams, the distant wail of sirens. Aisha didn't wait to see what happened next. She turned and ran, disappearing into the crowded streets before the authorities could track her. For days she stayed hidden, moving from place to place, avoiding security cameras and police checkpoints. The city that once felt like home had turned into a maze of dangers. Every news channel flashed her face, labeling her a fugitive, a murderer. But Aisha didn't see herself that way. She saw herself as the hand of justice, delivering the punishment that the law had refused to. She knew she couldn't do this alone. She sought out people who understood her pain, those who had lost loved ones to a broken system, those who had been denied justice. Some sympathized, offering her shelter and resources. Others warned her to turn herself in before it was too late. But there was no turning back. The net around her tightened. The police were closing in, her options shrinking. Aisha had a choice. She could keep running, living as a fugitive for the rest of her life, or she could face what she had done and take control of the narrative before the system branded her a villain forever. In the dead of night, she recorded a video, her face tired but defiant. She spoke not just of her crime, but of the crime that had been committed against her brother, the failure of justice, the corruption of power. She sent the video to every journalist, every activist, every platform that could spread her story. The next morning, as the police surrounded her hideout, she stood at the door, unarmed, ready to face her fate. The world watched as she was taken into custody. To some, she was a murderer. To others, a hero. But to Aisha, she was simply a sister who had done what she had to do. And now, she would find out if justice was truly blind, or if it only turned away when it was convenient. Nora sat stiffly in the courtroom, her hands clenched into fists as the trial progressed. Her brother's killer sat smugly in the defendant's chair, and she prayed that justice would prevail. But as the proceedings unfolded, something felt off. The judge seemed too dismissive, too lenient. Every piece of evidence was brushed aside, every testimony in her favor undermined. Then, she overheard something, a hushed conversation between the prosecutor and a defense lawyer. The words struck her like a dagger. The judge was involved. He helped cover it up. Nora's breath caught in her throat. Her brother's murder hadn't just been a random act of violence. It was orchestrated, and the man meant to deliver justice was one of the criminals. The verdict came, not guilty. Rage erupted inside her like wildfire. As the courtroom emptied and the judge stepped out of the building, Nora followed, her heart pounding. Her mind screamed for reason, for control, but she couldn't hear it over the deafening pulse of fury. Before she knew it, she had pulled the trigger. The shot rang through the air and the judge collapsed on the courthouse steps. Gasps and screams filled the street, but Nora didn't stay to see what happened next. She ran. For days, she remained in hiding, her face plastered across every news channel. The media called her a criminal, a cold-blooded murderer. But as she stayed in the shadows, she began uncovering more. The judge wasn't just corrupt. He was part of a powerful network protecting murderers, criminals, and those who manipulated the law for their own gain. The deeper she dug, the darker it became. Bribery, cover-ups, assassinations. Her brother had just been one victim in a long chain of crimes. Now she had a choice: keep running or fight back. With the world watching, Nora released the truth, leaking files, recordings, and evidence that shook the entire justice system. Protests erupted, investigations launched, and as the authorities finally closed in on her, she knew she had already won. They could call her a murderer, but she had exposed something far worse. Mira had spent years chasing the truth, piecing together fragments of a shattered past. Her brother's murder had been buried beneath layers of deception, but she had finally uncovered the killer, a powerful man with connections that ran deep. Now, as she sat in the courtroom, she was ready for justice, but justice never came. The judge's voice rang through the silent room. Not guilty. Mira's breath hitched. How? The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses had come forward. Yet, the murderer smirked as he walked free, untouched, untouchable. Her hands trembled as anger and despair battled inside her. This wasn't just a failure of justice. It was proof that the system was rigged. Someone had pulled strings. Someone had ensured that the truth would never see the light of day. Then, a gunshot, a scream. The judge collapsed on the courthouse steps, blood pooling beneath him. Panic erupted. People ran in every direction. And then, eyes turned to her. Mira's heart pounded as the weight of the moment crashed down. They think I did it. Security rushed toward her, but instincts kicked in before logic. She bolted. She didn't know who had fired the shot, but one thing was clear. This was a setup. If she was caught now, she'd never get the chance to prove her innocence. With every headline, the world painted her as a cold-blooded murderer, the woman who killed a judge in broad daylight. But Mira knew the truth ran deeper. Whoever had orchestrated this wanted to silence her, to make sure no one asked why the real killer had been set free. Now she was a fugitive, but she wasn't running away. She was chasing the truth. Hiding in the city's underbelly, she sought out old allies, those who had lost faith in the system just as she had. Clue by clue, she uncovered a conspiracy stretching far beyond her brother's murder, a network of corruption where money and power dictated justice. The real question wasn't who pulled the trigger, it was why. And if she didn't expose the truth soon, she might be the next one silenced. Lena had spent months preparing for this moment. Every sleepless night, every plan she made led to this day, the day justice would finally be served. She sat in the courtroom, barely breathing as the judge read the verdict. Not guilty. The words hit her like a hammer. The murderer, the man who had taken her sister's life, grinned as he walked free. Lena's world blurred. The system had failed. The law had failed. But she wouldn't. Outside the courthouse, the crowd swarmed, journalists shouting questions, cameras flashing. The killer laughed, shaking hands with his lawyer. And then, Lena stepped forward. Her hands were steady as she raised the gun. One shot. The killer barely had time to react before he crumpled to the ground. Gasps, screams, chaos. Lena turned, slipping into the crowd, her heart hammering. She had done it. She had avenged her sister. And she had gotten away with it, or so she thought. That night, her phone buzzed. An unknown number, a message, a video. Her own face stared back at her, gun in hand, the shot ringing clear. Someone had recorded everything. Panic clawed at her chest. She checked the news. Breaking, judge's ruling leads to public execution. Police were already searching for the shooter, for her. She had planned everything, except this. Now there was no way back. The walls were closing in. The question wasn't just whether she could escape. It was whether she could live with what she had done. Title: The Accidental Fugitive. Sarah stood in the courtroom, her fingers digging into her palms as she waited for the verdict. Her brother's murderer sat just a few feet away, smug and unconcerned. She had spent months hoping for justice, believing in the system. But as the judge spoke, her worst fears came true. Not guilty. Her breath caught. How? The evidence was there, the testimonies were clear. But the man who had taken her brother's life walked free, grinning as he exited the courthouse. Rage and grief twisted inside her as she followed the crowd outside. Protesters shouted, reporters swarmed, and the air crackled with tension. Then a scuffle broke out. Someone shoved, people yelled, bodies clashed. In the chaos, Sarah lost her balance. Her hand instinctively reached for the small pistol she carried for protection. Someone grabbed her arm, a struggle, a misfire. The gunshot echoed. Silence fell. Sarah's eyes widened in horror as the judge staggered back, blood blooming across his chest. He collapsed on the courthouse steps. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. People screamed. Police officers rushed forward. Someone shouted her name, then instinct took over. She ran. Adrenaline coursed through her veins as she darted through alleyways, her mind spinning. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had never meant to pull the trigger, but the law wouldn't care about intentions, only the crime. Within hours, her face was everywhere. Courthouse shooter at large. News anchors called her a murderer. The police launched a manhunt. She was no longer just a grieving sister. She was a fugitive. But something didn't add up. The way the verdict had been decided so quickly. The judge's expression before the shooting. Nervous, almost guilty. As Sarah hid in the city's shadows, she started digging. She hacked into court records, intercepted messages, and found whispers in the underground. Then she found it. The judge had ties to her brother's murderer, secret transactions, suppressed evidence. He hadn't just let a killer walk free, he had helped him. Sarah's blood ran cold. She had spent months searching for justice, but now justice was chasing her, and she had no choice but to fight back. With the police closing in, she had one final move: expose the truth before they silenced her forever.